The fluorescent lights of Austin Medical Center hummed their familiar tune as Rebecca Anderson adjusted her stethoscope around her neck, preparing for what would be another grueling 12-hour shift. At 34, she carried herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate life's storms with quiet determination. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and though her scrubs were freshly laundered, there was something in her green eyes that spoke of exhaustion that ran deeper than physical fatigue. "Rebecca, you're in room 314 today," called out Diana Phillips, the charge nurse, barely looking up from her clipboard. "Mrs. Henderson is being discharged, but we're getting a new admission around noon." "Got it," Rebecca replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had perfected this smile over the past 18 months, bright enough to reassure patients and colleagues, but hollow enough that anyone paying attention might notice the cracks beneath. As she walked down the sterile hallway, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished linoleum, Rebecca's mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting on her kitchen table. The final notice from her landlord sat on top, bright red letters demanding 3 months back rent or immediate eviction. Below that, medical bills from her mother's final months created a paper mountain of debt that seemed to grow taller each day. Despite her attempts to chip away at it with payment plans she could barely afford. Mrs. Henderson, an 82-year-old woman recovering from hip surgery, greeted Rebecca with a warm smile. "There's my favorite angel," she said, her voice thin but cheerful. "I was hoping you'd be here today." "How are we feeling this morning, Mrs. Henderson?" Rebecca asked, checking the woman's vitals with gentle, practiced hands. Despite everything weighing on her mind, she found solace in these moments. Caring for others had always been her calling, even when her own life felt like it was falling apart. "Much better, thanks to nurses like you," Mrs. Henderson replied, patting Rebecca's hand with her papery fingers. "You know, my granddaughter is about your age. She's a teacher up in Dallas. You remind me so much of her, always putting others first." Rebecca's throat tightened slightly at the comparison. Putting others first had been her defining characteristic for as long as she could remember. It was what had led her to spend her life savings on her mother's Alzheimer's care, what had driven her to take out loans she couldn't afford, and what had ultimately cost her the small house she'd bought with such pride 5 years ago. "That's very sweet of you to say," Rebecca managed, adjusting Mrs. Henderson's blankets. "The physical therapist will be by around 10 to help you with some walking exercises. Dr. Williams says if everything looks good, you should be able to go home this afternoon." As she prepared to leave the room, Mrs. Henderson called out, "Rebecca, dear, take care of yourself too, won't you? You look like you could use some kindness shown your way." The comment hit closer to home than Rebecca cared to admit. She nodded and stepped into the hallway, taking a moment to collect herself before moving on to her next patient. The truth was, kindness felt like a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Every decision she made now was filtered through a lens of financial survival. Every choice weighed against the mounting pressure of bills and deadlines. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her landlord, Richard Cummings. "Final notice expires tomorrow. Need to discuss payment or moving arrangements. Call me." Rebecca stared at the message for a long moment before sliding the phone back into her pocket. She had exactly $247 in her checking account and wouldn't be paid again for another week. Even then, her paycheck would barely cover groceries and her car payment, let alone the $2,400 she owed in back rent. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of medication rounds, patient assessments, and endless documentation. Rebecca moved through her tasks with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to compartmentalize emotions to function. But during her brief lunch break, sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria with a peanut butter sandwich she'd brought from home, the weight of her situation pressed down on her like a physical force. She thought about her mother, Catherine Anderson, who had raised her alone after her father left when Rebecca was 7. Her mother had been her everything: teacher, best friend, cheerleader, and moral compass. When the Alzheimer's diagnosis came 4 years ago, Rebecca hadn't hesitated to become her mother's primary caregiver and advocate. The disease had been cruel, stripping away pieces of the vibrant woman who had taught Rebecca about compassion and resilience. As her mother's condition worsened, Rebecca had made choice after choice that prioritized her mother's care over her own financial stability. Private caregivers when Rebecca was at work, experimental treatments not covered by insurance, modifications to make the house safer. Each decision had seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they had created a financial avalanche that eventually buried her. "Mind if I sit here?" asked Tom Rodriguez, a fellow nurse from the cardiac unit. Rebecca looked up, realizing she'd been staring at her sandwich without eating it for several minutes. "Of course," she replied, grateful for the distraction. Tom settled into the plastic chair across from her, opening a container of leftover pasta. They'd worked at Austin Medical Center for roughly the same amount of time and had developed an easy professional friendship built on shared experiences and mutual respect. "You okay?" he asked, studying her face with the perceptive eye of someone trained to notice when things weren't quite right. "You've seemed pretty distant lately." Rebecca considered deflecting with her usual "I'm fine" response, but something in Tom's genuine concern made her pause. She trusted him, and the burden of carrying everything alone was becoming unbearable. "Just some personal stuff," she said carefully. "Money troubles mostly, you know how it is." Tom nodded sympathetically. "Tell me about it." "My wife and I are still paying off her student loans, and with 2 kids, it never seems to end, does it?" Rebecca almost laughed at the comparison. Tom's struggles with student loans and child-rearing expenses seemed manageable compared to her situation, but she appreciated his attempt at solidarity. "Something like that," she agreed, taking a small bite of her sandwich. "If you ever need someone to cover a shift or pick up some extra hours, let me know," Tom offered. "I know Diana's been looking for people to work weekends, and the overtime pay might help." The suggestion was practical and well-meaning, but Rebecca was already working more hours than she should. Her body was running on caffeine and determination, and she wasn't sure how much more she could push herself without breaking down completely. "Thanks, Tom. I'll keep that in mind." The afternoon brought its own set of challenges. Rebecca's new patient, an elderly man named James Mitchell, arrived via ambulance after what appeared to be a serious car accident. He was conscious but clearly in pain, with multiple bruises and what the emergency room doctor suspected might be a few cracked ribs. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Rebecca, and I'll be your nurse during your stay here," she said, helping him get settled in room 314. Despite his injuries, there was something dignified about the man that immediately caught her attention. He appeared to be in his early 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded her of her grandfather. "Thank you, Rebecca," he replied, his voice rough with pain but polite. "I'm sorry to be such trouble. I honestly don't remember much about the accident." "You're not any trouble at all," Rebecca assured him, beginning her assessment. "The doctor wants to keep you for observation. Make sure there's no internal bleeding or concussion symptoms we missed. Do you have family we should contact?" James was quiet for a moment, staring at the ceiling. "My wife passed away 3 years ago. We never had children. There's really no one to call." Rebecca felt a familiar tug in her chest, the recognition of loneliness that she understood all too well. Since her mother's death, she had felt increasingly isolated, even surrounded by colleagues and patients. The financial stress had forced her to withdraw from friendships, unable to participate in social activities that cost money she didn't have. "Well, you're in good hands here," she told him. "I'll make sure you're comfortable." As she worked, checking his vitals and adjusting his IV, James watched her with the observant attention of someone accustomed to reading people. There was something about this nurse that intrigued him, a depth of compassion that seemed to go beyond professional duty, combined with an underlying sadness that she was clearly trying to hide. "You've been doing this long?" he asked as she recorded his blood pressure. "About 6 years," Rebecca replied. "I love what I do, even on the tough days." "That shows," James said quietly. "Not everyone has the gift for making people feel genuinely cared for. You do." The compliment caught Rebecca off guard, and she felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her work in such a personal way. Most days, she felt invisible, a functionary moving through the motions of care without anyone seeing the person behind the scrubs. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." As her shift wound down, Rebecca found herself checking on James more frequently than strictly necessary. There was something about his quiet dignity and gentle manner that drew her in. He didn't complain about his pain, didn't demand attention, and seemed genuinely grateful for even the smallest gestures of care. "How are you feeling?" she asked during her final rounds. "Better, thanks to you," he replied. "Rebecca, can I ask you something?" "Of course. You seem like you're carrying something heavy. I don't mean to pry, but sometimes talking to a stranger can help." Rebecca paused in her documentation, surprised by his perceptiveness. She had been so focused on maintaining her professional composure that she hadn't realized how transparent her struggles might be to someone really paying attention. "Just life stuff," she said finally. "Nothing that can't be worked out." James nodded, but his eyes suggested he understood more than she was saying. Sometimes the people who spend their lives taking care of others forget to leave room for someone to take care of them. The observation hit Rebecca like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was so profoundly true. She had spent so many years being the caregiver, first for her mother, now for her patients, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be on the receiving end of genuine care and concern. "I should let you get some rest," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "Rebecca?" James called as she reached the door. "Thank you for seeing me, not just as a patient, but as a person. It's been a while since someone looked at me that way." As Rebecca walked to her car in the hospital parking garage, James's words echoed in her mind. The evening air was warm and humid, typical for Austin in late spring, but she barely noticed the weather. Her 12-year-old Honda Civic looked even more tired than she felt, with a small dent in the rear bumper and a passenger side mirror held on with duct tape. She sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability in the privacy of her car. Tomorrow she would have to call her landlord and try to negotiate another extension. She would have to smile and pretend everything was fine while providing compassionate care to people who had no idea she was drowning in debt and desperation. But tonight, for just this moment, she let herself feel the full weight of her exhaustion and fear. James's kindness had cracked open something in her chest, and she found herself crying for the first time in months. Not the frustrated tears of someone overwhelmed by bills, but deeper sobs that came from a place of profound loneliness and loss. When the tears finally stopped, Rebecca wiped her face, started the car, and drove home to her small apartment where a stack of bills waited on the kitchen table like patient vultures. She had survived another day, and tomorrow she would find the strength to survive another one after that. It was all she could do, and for now, it had to be enough. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through Rebecca's restless sleep at 5:30 a.m., jolting her from dreams filled with foreclosure notices and her mother's confused face. She had managed maybe 4 hours of broken sleep, her mind churning through financial calculations that never seemed to add up to anything hopeful. The small studio apartment felt cramped and temporary. a far cry from the cozy two-bedroom house she had lost 6 months ago. As she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, Rebecca's eyes fell on the framed photograph on her nightstand, the last picture she had taken with her mother, Catherine, just 2 months before the Alzheimer's claimed the last remnants of recognition from her eyes. In the photo, they were both smiling, though Rebecca could now see the strain around her own eyes, the weight of knowing she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. The shower in her cramped bathroom barely produced warm water, and Rebecca had learned to make her morning routine quick and efficient. As she dressed in fresh scrubs, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her landlord's number, and her stomach dropped. It was barely 6 a.m. This couldn't be good news. "Hello, Mr. Cummings," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Rebecca, I've been more than patient." Richard Cummings' voice was tired but firm. "I know you're a good person, and I know you're trying, but I have mortgage payments to make too. The eviction notice goes to the court today unless we can work something out." Rebecca closed her eyes, leaning against her kitchenette counter. "I understand, Mr. Cummings. I get paid next Friday. I know I owe you 3 months, but if you could just give me until then, I can give you 1 month's rent and we can set up a plan for the rest." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Rebecca, you said the same thing 6 weeks ago. 1 month's rent doesn't solve the problem." "I know, but I'm picking up extra shifts and I'm looking into getting a second job. I just need a little more time." "I'm sorry, but I can't do it anymore. You have until Friday to either pay the full amount or arrange to move out. I don't want to do this, but I don't have a choice." After he hung up, Rebecca stood in her tiny kitchen, staring at the phone in her hand. Friday was 5 days away. Even with her paycheck, she would have maybe $800 after her car payment and other essential bills. She was $2,400 short, and there was no realistic way to bridge that gap. The drive to work felt longer than usual, each mile taking her further from solutions and deeper into a kind of desperation she had never experienced before. She had always been resourceful, always found a way to make things work, but this time felt different. This time felt like the end of something fundamental. As she walked through the hospital corridors, Rebecca forced herself to shift mental gears. Whatever was happening in her personal life, her patients deserved her full attention and best care. It was a discipline she had learned during her mother's illness. The ability to compartmentalize grief and fear so she could function when others needed her. James Mitchell was awake when she entered his room, sitting up in bed and looking considerably better than he had the day before. The bruising on his face had deepened to a spectacular purple and yellow palette, but his eyes were clearer and he seemed more alert. "Good morning, Rebecca," he greeted her with a genuine smile. "You look like you didn't sleep much." His observation caught her off guard. Most patients were so focused on their own discomfort that they didn't notice much about their caregiver's condition. But James seemed to have an unusual ability to see beyond the surface. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, beginning her morning assessment routine. "How are you feeling today? Any pain or discomfort I should know about?" "Much better, actually," James said, watching her as she checked his vitals. "The ribs are still sore, but nothing like yesterday. Rebecca, can I ask you something personal?" Rebecca paused, her stethoscope halfway to his chest. "I suppose. Are you in some kind of trouble?" The directness of the question startled her. She had worked so hard to maintain her professional composure, to keep her personal struggles from affecting her patient care. But something in James's tone suggested genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. "What makes you ask that?" she said carefully. "I've been around a long time, and I've gotten pretty good at reading people," James replied gently. "You have the look of someone carrying a burden that's too heavy for one person. And yesterday, when you thought I was sleeping, I heard you on the phone with someone about rent money." Rebecca felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She thought she had been discreet with that brief call to her landlord's office, but apparently not discreet enough. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," she said quietly. It's nothing that should affect your care. I'm not worried about my care, James assured her. I'm worried about you. Want to talk about it? For a moment, Rebecca considered deflecting again, maintaining the professional boundary that had served as her shield for so many years. But something about James's manner, the absence of judgment, the genuine concern, made her feel safe in a way she hadn't experienced in months. I lost my house, she said quietly, continuing with his vital signs as she spoke. My mother had Alzheimer's, and I spent everything I had trying to take care of her. Now I can't make rent on my apartment, and I'm getting evicted. James was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. That must have been incredibly difficult, caring for your mother through that disease. Rebecca nodded, surprised by the relief she felt at finally saying the words out loud to someone. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But she was all I had, and I was all she had. I couldn't just let her waste away in some state facility. Tell me about her, James requested softly. And so Rebecca found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in months. She talked about Catherine Anderson, who had worked 2 jobs to put Rebecca through nursing school. About the woman who had taught her that caring for others was not just a profession, but a calling. About watching Alzheimer's slowly steal away the most vibrant, intelligent person she had ever known. She was a high school English teacher for 32 years, Rebecca said, adjusting James's pillows. She could quote Shakespeare from memory and made even the most reluctant students fall in love with literature. When the disease started taking her words away, it was like watching someone lose their soul piece by piece. How long did you care for her? 4 years from diagnosis to... Rebecca's voice caught slightly. The last 2 years were the hardest. She didn't recognize me anymore, but I kept hoping that somewhere in there she knew she was loved. James reached out and gently touched Rebecca's hand. I'm sure she did know. Love like that doesn't just disappear, even when everything else does. Rebecca had to take a moment to compose herself before continuing with his care. It had been 8 months since her mother's death, but talking about it still felt like probing a fresh wound. The financial part wasn't supposed to be this bad, she continued, checking James's incision sites. I had insurance, and I thought I was being smart about it. But insurance doesn't cover everything, and the things it doesn't cover add up fast. Like what? Private caregivers when I had to work, physical therapy that might help maintain her mobility, special foods when she stopped eating regular meals, home modifications to keep her safe. None of it was covered, and all of it felt essential at the time. James listened without interruption as Rebecca described the gradual erosion of her financial stability. First, the credit cards, maxed out paying for things insurance wouldn't cover. Then the second mortgage on her house, which had seemed like a reasonable solution when she still believed her mother might improve. Finally, the personal loans from predatory lenders who promised easy money but delivered crushing interest rates. I kept thinking I could manage it, Rebecca said. I picked up extra shifts, worked holidays, took on additional responsibilities. But it was never enough. And after she died, I realized I had nothing left. No savings, no equity in the house, no family to help. Just debt and grief, and the knowledge that despite everything I had sacrificed, she died anyway. Do you regret it? James asked quietly. Rebecca considered the question seriously. It was something she had asked herself countless times during sleepless nights in her tiny apartment. No, she said finally. I regret that I couldn't save her, and I regret that I wasn't smarter about the financial planning. But I don't regret putting her needs first. She would have done the same for me. She raised a remarkable daughter, James observed. She raised me to believe that taking care of people is the most important thing you can do with your life. Sometimes I wonder if that lesson is what got me into this mess, but it's also what gets me up every morning. As Rebecca finished her morning routine with James, she felt unexpectedly lighter, despite having shared such painful details. There was something therapeutic about being heard, without judgment, about having someone acknowledge the difficulty of her choices without trying to fix everything or offer empty platitudes. "What happens now?" James asked as she prepared to leave. "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "I have until Friday to either come up with $2,400 or find somewhere else to live. After that, I guess I figure out how to start over." "Have you considered leaving Austin? Maybe finding work somewhere with a lower cost of living?" Rebecca had thought about it extensively. There were nursing positions available in smaller towns, rural hospitals that might offer housing assistance or lower living costs. But the idea of starting completely over somewhere where she knew no one felt overwhelmingly lonely. "Maybe," she said. "I've been here my whole life, but maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe I need a fresh start somewhere else." As she moved through her other patients that morning, Rebecca found her mind wandering back to her conversation with James. There had been something unusual about his questions, the way he listened with such focused attention. Most patients were understandably self-absorbed, concerned primarily with their own condition and comfort. But James seemed genuinely interested in her as a person, not just as a provider of care. During her lunch break, Rebecca called her landlord again, hoping to negotiate just a few more days. But Richard Cummings was done with extensions and payment plans. The eviction would proceed unless she paid in full by Friday. Next, she called 3 different payday loan companies, but even with her steady employment, the amounts they offered wouldn't come close to covering her rent debt. The interest rates were astronomical, and she would simply be trading one impossible debt for another. Her final call was to her former neighbor, Linda Walsh, who had bought some of Rebecca's furniture when she moved to the apartment. Linda was kind, but honest. She didn't have that kind of money to lend, and even if she did, Rebecca's financial situation made it unlikely she could pay it back. As Rebecca sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring at another peanut butter sandwich she couldn't quite bring herself to eat, the reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. In 5 days, she would be homeless. She had no family to turn to, no significant savings to draw from, and no realistic way to generate the money she needed in such a short time. For the first time since her mother's diagnosis 4 years ago, Rebecca allowed herself to consider the possibility that all her efforts had been futile, that maybe her mother would have been just as comfortable in a state facility, and Rebecca would still have her house, her savings, and her stability. The thought felt like a betrayal of everything she believed about love and duty, but it was impossible to ignore. She thought about James's suggestion of leaving Austin. Maybe he was right. Maybe the answer wasn't finding a way to stay in a place that held so many memories of loss, but in having the courage to start somewhere new. She could sell her car, use the money to relocate to a small town where her nursing experience might be more valued and her income might stretch further. But even as she considered this option, Rebecca felt a deep reluctance to let go of the last connection to her life with her mother. Austin was where Catherine Anderson had taught, where they had shared Sunday dinners and holiday traditions, where Rebecca had learned what it meant to care for someone unconditionally. Leaving felt like abandoning not just a place, but the last physical remnant of their life together. The afternoon passed in a blur of medication rounds and patient assessments. Rebecca moved through her tasks with mechanical efficiency, her mind cycling through increasingly desperate scenarios. Could she sleep in her car? Did she know anyone with a couch she could borrow temporarily? Were there any nursing positions that offered immediate housing? When she returned to James's room for her evening rounds, she found him sitting in the bedside chair, dressed in regular clothes and looking remarkably well for someone who had been in a car accident just over 24 hours earlier. "You're looking much better," she observed, checking his discharge paperwork. "I feel much better too, thanks to your excellent care." James replied. "Doctor says I can go home tomorrow morning." "That's wonderful news. Do you have someone to drive you?" "I'll call a taxi. It's not far to my place." Rebecca made notes on his chart, but she could feel James watching her with that same perceptive attention he had shown all day. "Rebecca, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning," he said quietly. "Mr. Mitchell, you don't need to worry about my problems. You should focus on recovering. What if I told you that helping good people through difficult times is something I care deeply about?" Rebecca paused in her documentation, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected statement. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes life puts people in each other's paths for reasons we don't immediately understand. And sometimes, when we're lucky, we get the opportunity to make a real difference in someone's life." There was something in James's tone that made Rebecca look at him more carefully. Behind his kind eyes, she sensed a depth of experience and perhaps resources that she hadn't recognized before. "I appreciate the sentiment," she said carefully, "but this isn't something that can be fixed by kindness alone. The numbers are what they are." "Numbers can be surprisingly flexible when approached from the right angle," James replied with a slight smile. "Rebecca, would you be willing to trust me with something?" "What do you mean?" "Don't make any irreversible decisions about leaving Austin until after I'm discharged tomorrow. Can you promise me that?" Rebecca studied his face, trying to understand what he was suggesting. There was something almost mysterious about his request, but also something reassuring. "Mr. Mitchell, I hope you're not thinking about trying to help with money or anything like that. I couldn't accept that kind of assistance from a patient." "I'm not asking you to accept anything right now," James said gently. "I'm just asking you to wait 24 hours before making any major decisions. Can you do that?" Against her better judgment, Rebecca found herself nodding. There was something about James that made her want to trust him, even though her rational mind warned her against hoping for solutions that seemed too good to be true. "Okay," she agreed. "I can wait until tomorrow evening to make any final decisions." "Thank you," James said, and Rebecca could have sworn she saw relief in his expression. Sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them. As Rebecca finished her shift and prepared to leave the hospital, James's words echoed in her mind. She had learned to be skeptical of promises and false hopes, but there had been something different about his manner. Not the desperate optimism of someone offering empty reassurance, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew something she didn't. Still, as she drove home to her tiny apartment where eviction notices and unpaid bills waited on the kitchen table, Rebecca reminded herself not to count on miracles. She had survived the past 4 years by facing reality head-on, and reality suggested that tomorrow would bring the same financial crisis she was facing today, regardless of whatever kindness James Mitchell might have in mind. But for the first time in months, Rebecca allowed herself to hope that maybe, somehow, tomorrow might be different. Rebecca's morning began with another restless night, her mind churning through James Mitchell's cryptic words about waiting 24 hours before making any major decisions. She had spent most of the night oscillating between hope and skepticism, wondering what a patient she had known for barely 2 days could possibly do to help with her overwhelming financial crisis. The spring Austin morning was already warm and humid as she made her way through the hospital corridors, and she could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. Today was Thursday. She had exactly 24 hours before her landlord's deadline expired and eviction proceedings would begin. When she entered James's room, she found him fully dressed and sitting in the bedside chair, a small overnight bag at his feet. He looked remarkably well for someone who had been in a serious car accident just 2 days earlier, and there was something different about his demeanor, an energy that hadn't been present during his recovery. "Good morning, Rebecca." He greeted her with a warm smile. "Ready to spring me from this place?" "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. You certainly look ready to go home," she replied, beginning his final assessment. "Any pain or discomfort I should document before your discharge?" "Nothing more than some residual soreness," James assured her. "I heal quickly for an old guy." As Rebecca worked through the discharge paperwork, she found herself studying James more carefully than she had before. Now that he was alert and dressed in his own clothes, a well-made button-down shirt and quality khakis, she could see that he carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone accustomed to respect and perhaps authority. His hands were weathered but manicured, and his watch, though understated, looked expensive. "Mr. Mitchell, can I ask what kind of work you do?" Rebecca said as she completed his medication instructions. James paused for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. "I'm retired now, but I spent most of my career in the music business." "Really? That sounds interesting. What did you do?" "I worked behind the scenes mostly. Management, logistics, that sort of thing. Nothing glamorous, but I was good at taking care of the details that let artists focus on their music." There was something modest about the way he described his career, but Rebecca sensed there was more to the story than he was sharing. She had met people in various professions during her years as a nurse, and there was usually a correlation between someone's manner and their level of responsibility or success. James carried himself like someone who had been in charge of important things. "That must have been exciting, being around music and performers," she said, helping him organize his discharge paperwork. "It had its moments," James agreed with a slight smile. "But the best part was working with good people, helping them succeed, being part of something larger than myself." As Rebecca prepared to escort James to the hospital exit, he turned to her with that same intense attention she had noticed throughout his stay. "Rebecca, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay," she said, though something in his tone made her slightly nervous. "If someone offered you a way to solve your financial problems, not a loan, not charity, but a legitimate opportunity to earn what you need, would you be interested?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. After 2 days of James expressing concern about her situation, she had wondered if he might try to offer some kind of financial help, which she would have to decline. But this sounded different. "What kind of opportunity?" she asked carefully. "I can't explain it fully right now," James said, "but I can tell you that it would involve using your skills as a caregiver, and it would be temporary. Maybe a few weeks." Rebecca felt her skepticism rising. After years of financial struggle, she had learned to be wary of opportunities that sounded too good to be true. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but I can't afford to chase after vague possibilities right now. I need concrete solutions." "I understand your caution," James replied, "but sometimes the best opportunities come from unexpected places. Would you be willing to at least hear more details before you make a decision?" Something in his manner suggested this was not a casual offer or an attempt to take advantage of her desperation. James had shown himself to be thoughtful and genuine during their interactions, and Rebecca found herself curious despite her reservations. "What would hearing more details involve?" she asked. "Someone I know would like to meet you. Someone who might be able to offer the kind of opportunity I'm talking about. Would you be willing to have lunch with me today? I promise you, if nothing else, you'll get a good meal out of it." Rebecca hesitated. Meeting with strangers to discuss vague employment opportunities felt risky, especially when she was in such a vulnerable position. But James had been nothing but kind and respectful, and her current situation was so dire that almost any legitimate possibility was worth exploring. "Where would this lunch be?" she asked. "There's a little place called Hill's Cafe on South Lamar. Do you know it?" Rebecca nodded. Hill's Cafe was a well-established Austin institution known for its comfort food and down-to-earth atmosphere. It was exactly the kind of place she would expect someone like James to choose. Unpretentious, but quality. "I could meet you there at 1 o'clock, if that works with your schedule," James continued. "The person I want you to meet will join us." Against her better judgment, Rebecca found herself agreeing. "Okay, 1 o'clock at Hill's Cafe. But Mr. Mitchell, I need you to understand that I can't afford to get my hopes up about something that might not be real. I wouldn't ask you to meet us unless I believed this could genuinely help you," James assured her. "And Rebecca, thank you for trusting me enough to come." As Rebecca escorted James to the hospital exit and watched him get into a taxi that looked newer and cleaner than most, she wondered what she had just agreed to. Her practical mind warned her against putting faith in mysterious opportunities from people she barely knew. But another part of her, the part that had been crushed under the weight of impossible circumstances, whispered that maybe this was the lifeline she needed. The rest of her morning shift passed in a blur of routine tasks, but Rebecca found it difficult to concentrate on anything other than the upcoming lunch meeting. She had asked her supervisor for an extended lunch break, claiming a medical appointment, which wasn't entirely untrue, given that her financial stress was definitely affecting her health. At 12:45, Rebecca stood in front of Hill's Cafe, second-guessing her decision to come. The restaurant was busier than she had expected for a Thursday afternoon, filled with a mix of business people, construction workers, and what appeared to be several musicians based on their casual dress and instrument cases. She spotted James immediately, sitting in a corner booth with another man whose back was turned to her. As she approached the table, James stood and greeted her with the same warm smile she had come to associate with him. "Rebecca, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "I'd like you to meet my friend, Daniel Cooper." The man turned around, and Rebecca found herself looking at someone who appeared to be in his mid-40s, with graying brown hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was dressed simply in jeans and a button-down shirt. But like James, he carried himself with quiet confidence. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Rebecca," Daniel said, standing to shake her hand. "James has told me wonderful things about the care you provided him." "Thank you," Rebecca replied, settling into the booth. She studied both men, trying to get a sense of what this meeting was really about. "I have to admit, I'm curious about what kind of opportunity you wanted to discuss." Daniel and James exchanged a brief look, and Rebecca sensed some kind of silent communication passing between them. "Before we get into that," Daniel said, "James tells me you're facing some significant financial challenges. Would you be comfortable telling me a bit about your situation?" Rebecca hesitated. She had already shared more personal information with James than she normally would with a patient, but discussing her problems with a complete stranger felt different. "I'm not sure how much detail you need," she said carefully. "Only what you're comfortable sharing," Daniel assured her, "but I want to understand what kind of help might be most useful." Something in Daniel's manner put Rebecca at ease. Like James, he seemed genuinely interested in her well-being rather than merely curious about her troubles. "The short version is that I spent everything I had caring for my mother during her battle with Alzheimer's," Rebecca said. "Now I'm behind on rent, facing eviction, and I don't see a way to catch up financially." "How much are you behind?" Daniel asked directly. The question was blunt, but his tone remained kind. Rebecca appreciated that he wasn't dancing around the practical realities of her situation. $2,400 in back rent, plus whatever I'll owe going forward. My landlord has given me until tomorrow to pay or face eviction." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "And what's your monthly income from the hospital?" "About $3,200 after taxes, but after my car payment, insurance, utilities, and basic expenses, there's not much left over." "What would it take for you to get back on stable ground financially?" Rebecca had run these calculations so many times that the answer came automatically. If I could catch up on the back rent and maybe save a month ahead, I could manage my regular expenses. So probably $4,000 total would get me stable. Daniel was quiet for a moment, appearing to consider this information. James watched the exchange with interest, occasionally nodding as if Rebecca's answers confirmed something he had already told Daniel. "Rebecca," Daniel said finally, "what would you say if I told you there was a way for you to earn that amount of money in about 3 weeks?" "I'd say it sounds too good to be true," Rebecca replied honestly. "I've learned to be skeptical of opportunities that promise quick solutions to long-term problems." "That's a smart attitude," Daniel agreed. "But what I'm about to propose isn't too good to be true. It's challenging work, it requires complete discretion, and it would temporarily disrupt your normal routine. But it's legitimate, and it pays well." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken, despite her attempts to remain skeptical. "What kind of work?" Daniel glanced around the restaurant, then leaned forward slightly. "I need someone to provide private nursing care for a family member who's recovering from a medical procedure. The patient values privacy above almost everything else, which is why the compensation is significantly higher than normal nursing rates." "What kind of medical procedure?" Rebecca asked, her professional instincts engaging. "Nothing dramatic or dangerous," Daniel assured her. "Outpatient surgery, but the recovery requires monitoring and assistance with daily activities for a few weeks. The challenge isn't medical complexity. It's the need for someone trustworthy who can provide care without any publicity or attention." Rebecca considered this explanation. Private nursing care for wealthy individuals wasn't uncommon, and she could understand why someone might pay premium rates for discretion and personalized attention. "Where would this care be provided?" she asked. "The patient's private residence. About an hour outside Austin. You'd need to stay on site for the duration of the assignment, but all meals and accommodations would be provided." "And the compensation?" $5,000 for 3 weeks of work, Daniel said quietly. Rebecca felt her breath catch. $5,000 was more than she made in 6 weeks at the hospital, and it would not only solve her immediate crisis, but give her a financial cushion she hadn't had in years. "That seems like a lot of money for routine post-operative care," she said, her suspicions rising again. "It is a lot of money," Daniel agreed. "But you'd be giving up your normal life for 3 weeks. You'd be on call 24 hours a day. And discretion is absolutely essential. The patient has had problems in the past with people selling information to tabloids or taking unauthorized photographs." The mention of tabloids made Rebecca realize they were talking about someone famous. Her mind raced through possibilities, an actor, politician, or maybe a musician, given James's background in the music industry. "Are we talking about a celebrity?" she asked directly. Daniel and James exchanged another look before Daniel nodded. "Yes, someone who's well known enough that their medical situation could become tabloid news if it became public." Rebecca sat back in the booth, processing this information. She had never provided care for anyone famous, but she understood the unique challenges it might present. The high compensation suddenly made more sense. "What kind of surgery are we talking about?" she asked. "I need to know if it's something within my scope of practice." "Minor orthopedic procedure," Daniel replied. "Nothing that would require specialized ICU experience or advanced certifications. But the patient needs someone skilled and trustworthy to assist with mobility, medications, and general care during recovery." "Why me?" Rebecca asked. "There are plenty of nurses with more experience in private care." James spoke up for the first time during their exchange. "Because you're the kind of person who sees patients as human beings, not just medical conditions. And because you understand what it means to take care of someone you care about, even when it's difficult." Rebecca felt a flush of warmth at James's words, but she forced herself to focus on the practical aspects of the proposal. "If I were to consider this," she said carefully, What would the timeline look like? The surgery is scheduled for Monday, Daniel explained. If you're interested, you'd need to give notice at the hospital by tomorrow and be ready to start Sunday evening. The timing was impossibly tight, but it also aligned perfectly with her eviction deadline. If this opportunity was legitimate, she could call her landlord tomorrow morning with the news that she would have the money by the following week. "I'd need to think about this," Rebecca said. "It's a big decision to leave my job, even temporarily." "Of course," Daniel replied, "but I do need an answer by tomorrow morning. The patient needs to know who will be providing care before the surgery." As they finished their lunch, Daniel provided more details about the arrangement. Rebecca would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, receive half of her compensation up front, and be provided with a dedicated phone to contact medical support if any complications arose during the patient's recovery. "One more question," Rebecca said, as they prepared to leave. "How do you know I won't take the money and disappear or sell information to tabloids despite the non-disclosure agreement?" Daniel smiled. "James is an excellent judge of character. He's convinced me that you're someone who can be trusted, and I've learned to rely on his judgment." As Rebecca walked back to her car, her mind was spinning with possibilities and concerns. The opportunity seemed almost too perfect, exactly the amount of money she needed, available at precisely the moment she needed it most. But the circumstances were unusual enough to make her cautious. She spent the rest of her shift at the hospital thinking through the decision from every angle. The work itself didn't sound particularly challenging. Post-operative care was well within her expertise. The privacy requirements, while unusual, seemed reasonable for someone famous enough to worry about tabloid coverage, and the compensation would solve her immediate problems while giving her breathing room to rebuild her financial stability. But leaving her job, even temporarily, felt risky. What if the assignment didn't work out? What if there were complications that made the situation more difficult than Daniel had described? What if this was some kind of elaborate scam, though she couldn't imagine what the scammers would gain from her participation? During her dinner break, Rebecca called her supervisor to inquire about taking extended leave. She learned that she had accumulated enough sick time and vacation days to cover 3 weeks, though using them all at once would leave her with no backup if she faced future health issues or emergencies. As she drove home that evening, Rebecca realized that her decision came down to a choice between two kinds of risk. She could stick with her current situation, face almost certain eviction tomorrow, and try to rebuild her life from a position of homelessness and financial ruin. Or she could take a chance on an unusual opportunity that could solve her problems quickly, but required her to trust people she had just met. Neither option felt entirely safe, but one offered hope, while the other offered only the certainty of continued struggle. That night, Rebecca sat at her small kitchen table with the stack of bills that had become her evening companions. But for the first time in months, she wasn't calculating how far behind she was falling. Instead, she was imagining what it would feel like to pay off her debts, to have money in her savings account, to face her landlord with confidence instead of desperation. She thought about her mother, who had raised her to believe that sometimes life presents opportunities that require courage to embrace. Catherine Anderson had taken risks throughout her life, leaving a bad marriage, going back to school as a single mother, accepting a teaching position in a district that paid less but offered more rewarding work. "Sometimes you have to jump and trust that you'll figure out how to fly on the way down," her mother had once told her during Rebecca's own decision about becoming a nurse. As Rebecca prepared for bed, she realized that her decision was already made. Tomorrow morning she would call Daniel Cooper and accept the position. She would give notice at the hospital, call her landlord with the good news about payment, and begin preparing for 3 weeks that could change the trajectory of her entire life. For the first time in months, Rebecca fell asleep without the weight of impossible problems pressing down on her chest. Instead, she drifted off thinking about new possibilities and the courage it takes to trust in unexpected kindness from strangers who might, somehow, become the answer to prayers she had stopped believing anyone was hearing. Rebecca's phone rang at exactly 7 a.m. Friday morning, jolting her from the first peaceful night's sleep she'd had in weeks. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but she answered immediately, somehow knowing it would be related to yesterday's conversation. "Good morning, Rebecca. This is Daniel Cooper. I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," Rebecca replied, sitting up in bed. "I've actually been awake for a while, thinking about everything we discussed yesterday." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff. "I'd like to accept the position." There was a pause on the other end, followed by what sounded like genuine relief in Daniel's voice. "I'm very glad to hear that. James said you were exactly the right person for this job, and I trust his judgment completely." Over the next hour, Daniel walked Rebecca through the logistics of her new temporary position. She would need to report to the hospital that morning to request immediate personal leave, using her accumulated vacation and sick time. Daniel assured her that if there were any complications with her leave request, he had contacts who could help smooth things over. "I've already prepared the paperwork," Daniel explained. "There's a non-disclosure agreement, employment contract, and direct deposit forms for your payment. Can you meet me at 10 a.m. to review everything?" "Of course." "Where?" "The same place we met yesterday, Hill's Cafe. And Rebecca, bring whatever personal items you'll need for 3 weeks. After we finish the paperwork, I'll drive you directly to the location where you'll be working." After Daniel hung up, Rebecca sat in her bed for several minutes, still processing the rapid pace of events. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been facing homelessness and financial ruin. Now she was about to embark on a well-paid assignment that would solve her immediate problems and provide financial security she hadn't known in years. Her first call was to her landlord, Richard Cummings. When she told him she would be able to pay the full amount owed by Monday, there was skepticism in his voice. "Rebecca, I appreciate the optimism, but where is this money coming from? Yesterday you couldn't scrape together 1 month's rent." "I've been offered a temporary nursing position that pays very well," she explained. "I'll receive partial payment up front today and the balance early next week." There was a long pause before Richard responded. "Look, I've grown fond of you during this whole mess, and I genuinely hope this works out. But I can't put off the eviction paperwork any longer. If you can bring me the full $2,400 by Monday evening, we'll tear up the notices and start fresh. But if not, I understand," Rebecca assured him. "The money will be there." Her next call was to Diana Phillips, her supervisor at Austin Medical Center. Requesting immediate leave for 3 weeks was highly irregular, but Rebecca explained that a family emergency required her to travel out of state to provide care for a relative. "This is very short notice," Diana said, though her tone was more concerned than disapproving. "Are you sure you can't work out some other arrangement? We're already short-staffed this month." "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't absolutely necessary," Rebecca replied. "I have enough accumulated time to cover the leave, and I promise I'll be back as soon as possible." After some discussion about coverage for her patients and administrative details, Diana agreed to process the leave request. Rebecca would officially be on personal leave starting Monday, though she would need to wrap up her current patient assignments by Sunday. At exactly 10 a.m., Rebecca found Daniel waiting for her at the same corner booth they had occupied the day before. This time, however, he had a leather portfolio spread across the table, filled with official-looking documents. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said as she sat down. "I know this is all happening very fast, but the timing is critical for the patient's schedule." Daniel walked her through each document methodically. The non-disclosure agreement was comprehensive, covering not just information about the patient's medical condition, but any details about their personal life, residence, or associates. The penalty for violation was severe, immediate termination and financial damages that would far exceed what Rebecca would earn from the assignment. "I want to be very clear about this," Daniel emphasized. "What you'll see and hear during the next 3 weeks absolutely cannot be shared with anyone. Not friends, not family, not other medical professionals unless it's a genuine emergency. Are you comfortable with that level of discretion?" "I am," Rebecca replied, though the seriousness of the agreement made her realize she was entering a world very different from anything she had experienced in her nursing career. The employment contract was equally detailed, specifying her duties, hours, compensation schedule, and living arrangements. She would be on call 24 hours a day, with time off only as approved by the patient's needs and schedule. All meals would be provided, and she would have access to a private room and bathroom in the patient's residence. "The location is about an hour south of Austin," Daniel explained. "It's a private property, quite secluded, which is important for the patient's privacy during recovery." When they reached the compensation section, Daniel pulled out a bank envelope. "As we discussed, your total compensation is $5,000. Here's $2,500 as your upfront payment, and you'll receive the balance when the assignment is completed successfully." Rebecca stared at the envelope, hardly believing she was holding more cash than she had seen in over a year. The bills inside were crisp hundreds, and she could immediately envision paying her landlord, her car payment, and her credit card minimums with money left over for groceries and gas. "I need you to sign here acknowledging receipt," Daniel said, pointing to a line on the contract. As Rebecca signed the documents, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of the first day of nursing school. Anticipation about new challenges combined with uncertainty about whether she was truly prepared for what lay ahead. "Now," Daniel said, gathering the completed paperwork, "are you ready to meet your patient?" Rebecca's stomach fluttered with nervousness. "As ready as I can be without knowing who I'll be caring for." Daniel smiled mysteriously. "I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. This person is not only talented and successful, but genuinely kind. James and I both believe you'll find the assignment rewarding beyond just the financial compensation." They left Hill's Cafe in Daniel's luxury SUV, heading south on Interstate 35 towards San Marcos. As they drove, Daniel provided more background about the upcoming surgery and recovery period. "The patient is having arthroscopic knee surgery Monday morning," he explained. "Nothing major, but enough to require limited mobility for a few weeks. Your primary responsibilities will be assistance with daily activities, medication management, and monitoring for any signs of complications." "What's the patient's age and general health status?" Rebecca asked, falling into her professional mode. "Mid-50s, excellent overall health, very active lifestyle, which is partly what necessitated the knee repair. No underlying medical conditions, no medication allergies that we know of." As they drove through the Texas Hill Country, Rebecca found herself relaxing for the first time in months. The landscape was beautiful, with rolling hills covered in spring wildflowers and live oak trees. Whatever challenges the next 3 weeks might bring, at least she would be spending them in a peaceful, scenic environment. "Daniel, can I ask how you and James know each other?" she said as they turned onto a smaller highway. "We've worked together in the music industry for over 20 years, Daniel replied. "James was one of the best tour managers in the business, incredibly organized, completely trustworthy, and genuinely cared about the artists he worked with. When he decided to semi-retire, several musicians asked him to help manage their personal affairs because they trusted him so completely." "Is that what he does for your patient?" "Among other things." James handles a lot of the day-to-day logistics that allow the patient to focus on music and family. When the knee surgery was scheduled, James immediately thought of you because of the exceptional care you provided him at the hospital. As they turned onto an unmarked gravel road, Daniel's expression became more serious. "Rebecca, I want to prepare you for something. The person you're about to meet is someone you've probably heard of. Try not to let that affect how you provide care. They're just a person dealing with a medical issue, like any other patient you've treated." Rebecca nodded, though she could feel her heart rate increasing. She had wondered about the patient's identity since yesterday's conversation, but the reality of meeting someone famous was more intimidating than she had expected. The gravel road wound through dense trees for nearly a mile before emerging into a clearing that took Rebecca's breath away. A beautiful ranch-style house sat surrounded by perfectly maintained grounds, with a view of rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. The architecture was elegant but understated, suggesting wealth that didn't need to announce itself. As Daniel parked in the circular driveway, Rebecca saw James Mitchell emerge from the house, walking toward them with a warm smile. Seeing him in this context, clearly comfortable and at home in these surroundings, confirmed Rebecca's suspicion that there was much more to James than he had initially revealed. "How are you feeling about all this?" Daniel asked as they sat in the parked car. "Nervous," Rebecca admitted, "but also grateful. This opportunity is literally saving my life." "Just be yourself," Daniel advised. "That's why James recommended you, and that's what the patient needs most, someone genuine who will treat them like a human being rather than a celebrity." As they walked toward the house, Rebecca tried to calm her nerves by focusing on the professional aspects of her assignment. Regardless of who her patient was, she had the skills and experience to provide excellent care. The celebrity status was irrelevant to her medical responsibilities. James met them at the front door, embracing Daniel like an old friend and greeting Rebecca with obvious pleasure. "I'm so glad you decided to accept the position," he told her. "I have a very good feeling about the next few weeks." "Thank you for thinking of me," Rebecca replied. "I'm looking forward to meeting my patient." James and Daniel exchanged a meaningful look, and Rebecca sensed they were both enjoying some private knowledge about what was about to happen. "Are you ready?" James asked, his eyes twinkling with anticipation. Rebecca took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and nodded. "I'm ready." As they walked through the elegantly furnished entrance hall toward the back of the house, Rebecca could hear the faint sound of a guitar and a voice she almost recognized. The voice was warm and distinctive, singing what sounded like a classic country song, though she couldn't quite place the melody. James led them toward a set of French doors that opened onto a spacious back patio. Through the glass, Rebecca could see someone sitting in a chair with their back to them, playing guitar and singing softly. The late afternoon sun created a golden backdrop, and the scene had an almost dreamlike quality. "He's been looking forward to meeting you," James said quietly, reaching for the door handle. As the door opened and they stepped onto the patio, the guitar playing stopped. The man in the chair turned around, and Rebecca felt her knees nearly buckle as she found herself looking directly into the kind eyes and familiar face of George Strait. For a moment, time seemed suspended as Rebecca processed the impossibility of what she was seeing. George Strait, the king of country music, the artist whose songs had provided the soundtrack to countless moments in her life, was sitting not 20 feet away from her, smiling with the same warmth and genuineness she had come to associate with James. "You must be Rebecca," George said, standing and walking toward her with a slight limp that reminded her why she was here. "James has told me wonderful things about you. I'm George, and I'm very pleased to meet you." Rebecca found herself shaking hands with one of the most beloved figures in American music, trying to process the surreal nature of the moment while maintaining some semblance of professional composure. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Strait, she managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Please, just call me George, he said with that famous smile. We're going to be spending a lot of time together over the next few weeks, and I'd like us to be comfortable with each other. As Rebecca stood on the patio of George Strait's private ranch, surrounded by the people who had engineered this incredible opportunity, she realized that her life had just taken a turn she never could have imagined. The financial crisis that had brought her to the edge of desperation had somehow led her to this moment, caring for someone whose music had been a constant presence in her life, in a setting that felt like something from a dream. James tells me you're an exceptional nurse, George continued, and that you understand what it means to take care of people you care about. That's exactly what I need right now. Rebecca looked at James, who was watching the scene with obvious satisfaction, and Daniel, who was smiling like someone who had just successfully orchestrated a complex plan. I promise to take very good care of you, Rebecca said, finally finding her professional voice again. When is your surgery scheduled? Monday morning early, George replied. But tonight? Why don't you get settled in and let us show you around? We can talk about the medical stuff tomorrow. As the sun set over the Texas hill country and Rebecca began to understand the magnitude of the opportunity she had been given, she thought about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. Her mother's illness had cost her everything she thought she valued, her savings, her house, her financial security. But it had also led her to provide care for James Mitchell, with the kind of compassion that had impressed him enough to recommend her for the opportunity of a lifetime. Standing on George Strait's patio, holding an envelope containing more money than she had seen in over a year, preparing to spend 3 weeks caring for one of her musical heroes, Rebecca realized that sometimes losing everything is the first step toward finding something even better than what you thought you wanted. The next 3 weeks promised to be unlike anything she had ever experienced, but for the first time in months, Rebecca was looking forward to the future with excitement rather than dread. The Monday morning surgery had gone perfectly. Rebecca had accompanied George to the outpatient surgical center, where she had been impressed by the discreet efficiency of the medical team Daniel had assembled. The arthroscopic knee procedure was routine, and George's recovery was proceeding exactly as expected. Now, 2.5 weeks into her assignment, Rebecca had settled into a comfortable rhythm at the ranch. Her days were filled with assisting George with physical therapy exercises, managing his pain medication, and ensuring he followed the surgeon's restrictions on activity. But what she hadn't expected was how much she would enjoy the personal conversations that filled the hours between medical tasks. George Strait, she had discovered, was exactly what his public image suggested: genuine, humble, and deeply committed to his family and music. He was also an excellent patient, following medical instructions precisely and maintaining an optimistic attitude despite the frustration of being temporarily limited in his mobility. You know, Rebecca, George said as she helped him through his morning stretching routine, I've been thinking about something. What's that? She replied, guiding his leg through the range of motion exercises prescribed by his physical therapist. James told me about what happened with your mother and how that led to your financial difficulties. I've been wondering about something. Rebecca paused in the exercise routine, sensing that George was leading up to something important. Over the past few weeks, they had talked extensively about her mother's battle with Alzheimer's, and George had listened to her stories with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite conversation. What have you been wondering about? George was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. I've been wondering if you've considered what you want to do after this assignment ends. Have you thought about whether you want to go back to the hospital or if there might be other opportunities that would be more fulfilling? Rebecca had been trying not to think too much about the end of her assignment, which was now only 4 days away. The 3 weeks at the ranch had been like living in a different world. Peaceful, comfortable, and free from the financial stress that had dominated her life for so long. Returning to her small apartment and the daily grind of hospital nursing felt increasingly unappealing. "I suppose I'll go back to Austin Medical Center," she said. "I mean, I love being a nurse, and I need steady employment. But is that what you really want?" George pressed gently. "Or is that just what seems most practical?" Rebecca considered his question seriously. The truth was, her time at the ranch had reminded her why she had become a nurse in the first place. The satisfaction of providing personalized care, of building meaningful relationships with people who needed help, of making a real difference in someone's recovery and well-being. "I guess I haven't let myself think about what I really want," she admitted. "For so long, my choices have been driven by necessity rather than preference." George nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. But now that you've solved your immediate financial crisis, maybe it's time to consider what would make you truly happy." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James, who had driven down from Austin with what he described as some important paperwork for George to review. Rebecca had learned that James managed many aspects of George's business affairs, and his visits usually involved contracts, scheduling, or other administrative matters. "How's our patient doing today?" James asked, joining them on the patio where they had been doing the exercise routine. "Doing great," George replied. "Rebecca's been taking excellent care of me, as you predicted she would." James smiled at Rebecca with obvious satisfaction. "I had a good feeling about this arrangement from the beginning." As George and James discussed some upcoming scheduling issues, Rebecca excused herself to prepare his lunch. But as she worked in the kitchen, she could hear fragments of their conversation through the open windows. They seemed to be discussing something more complicated than usual business matters, and she caught references to the foundation and new programs that didn't make immediate sense to her. When she returned to the patio with George's meal, both men became quiet in a way that suggested they had been talking about something they didn't want her to overhear. "Everything okay?" she asked, setting down the tray. "Everything's fine," George assured her. "James and I were just discussing some ideas for a new project." That afternoon, while George napped, James approached Rebecca with an unusual request. "Rebecca, would you mind taking a walk with me? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." They strolled through the beautiful grounds surrounding the ranch house, eventually settling on a bench that overlooked a small pond stocked with fish. The setting was peaceful and private, perfect for the kind of serious conversation James seemed to have in mind. "I want to ask you about something," James began, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. How would you feel about not going back to hospital nursing? What would you think about doing something different with your medical skills?" Rebecca felt a flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. James's question echoed George's earlier comments about considering what she really wanted from her career. "What kind of something different?" she asked. "Before I explain that, let me ask you another question. What did you enjoy most about caring for your mother during her illness?" Rebecca didn't need to think long about her answer. The personal connection, being able to provide exactly the kind of care she needed when she needed it, making sure she felt loved and dignified even when the disease was taking so much away from her. "And what do you enjoy most about your work here with George?" "The same thing, really. Being able to focus completely on one person's needs, building a relationship that goes beyond just medical tasks, feeling like I'm making a real difference in his recovery and comfort." James nodded, as if her answers confirmed something he had already suspected. "Rebecca, What would you say if I told you there was a way to do that kind of nursing permanently, to work with people who need personalized, compassionate care, and to be compensated well for that level of attention and skill? I'd say it sounds too good to be true, Rebecca replied honestly. That kind of position doesn't exist in the real world. Actually, it does, James said with a slight smile. It's just not the kind of job that gets advertised in nursing journals. Over the next hour, James explained an opportunity that Rebecca never could have imagined. George Strait, he revealed, was in the process of establishing a private foundation focused on providing high-quality, personalized care for people facing serious illnesses who couldn't afford the kind of attention that wealthy individuals took for granted. The foundation will employ nurses, social workers, and other caregivers who specialize in providing the kind of one-on-one care you gave your mother, James explained. The clients will be people who are dealing with Alzheimer's, cancer, chronic illnesses, or recovering from major surgeries, but who don't have the resources to hire private care. That sounds amazing, Rebecca said. But how would something like that be sustainable financially? The foundation will be funded by donations, grants, and George's personal contributions. The goal isn't to make a profit, but to provide a service that currently doesn't exist, high-quality private nursing care for people who need it most. Rebecca felt her heart racing as she began to understand what James was describing. It was exactly the kind of work she had dreamed of doing, meaningful, personal, and focused on the patients who most needed compassionate care. And you're telling me about this because George would like you to be the Foundation's first employee. He wants you to help develop the program, train other caregivers, and serve as the lead nurse for the most complex cases. Rebecca stared at James, hardly believing what she was hearing. Are you serious? Completely serious. Your salary would be $75,000 a year, plus benefits and a housing allowance. You'd have the resources to provide the kind of care you believe in, without worrying about hospital bureaucracy or insurance limitations. The offer was so far beyond anything Rebecca had hoped for that she struggled to process it. Not only would she be able to pursue the kind of nursing she was passionate about, but she would be financially secure in a way she had never experienced. "Why me?" she asked. "I'm sure there are nurses with more experience or better qualifications." "Because you understand what it means to love someone through a devastating illness," James replied simply. "Because you provided exceptional care to George, not because he's famous, but because that's who you are as a person. And because George believes you have the kind of compassion and integrity the Foundation needs." That evening, over dinner on the patio, George formally offered Rebecca the position himself. "I've been thinking about this foundation for several years," he told her. "But I wasn't sure how to structure it or who I could trust to help make it work. After spending these weeks with you, I know you're the right person to help me build something meaningful." Rebecca felt tears building in her eyes as she listened to George describe his vision for the foundation. It was inspired, he explained, by his own family's experiences with illness and aging, and by his recognition that quality healthcare had become a luxury available only to those who could afford to pay premium prices. "The foundation will be called Caring Hands," George continued, "and our mission will be to provide the kind of personalized, compassionate care that everyone deserves, regardless of their ability to pay for it." "I don't know what to say," Rebecca managed, her voice thick with emotion. "This is more than I ever dreamed of." "Say yes," George replied with that warm smile she had come to love. "Say, you'll help me build something that will make a real difference in people's lives." Rebecca looked around the patio where she had spent so many hours over the past 3 weeks. At George, whose music had soundtracked her life and whose generosity was now transforming it. At James, whose perceptive kindness had set this entire chain of events in motion. at Daniel, who had taken a chance on a desperate nurse and offered her an opportunity that seemed impossible. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then stronger. "Yes, absolutely yes. I would be honored to help you build the Caring Hands Foundation." George's face broke into a huge grin, and he reached across the table to clasp her hands. "Rebecca, I can't tell you how happy that makes me. I have a feeling we're going to change a lot of lives together." As they talked late into the evening about the Foundation's goals and Rebecca's role in developing the program, she felt a profound sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for months. The work would be challenging, but it would also be exactly the kind of nursing she had always dreamed of doing. "There's one more thing," George said as the evening wound down. "I know you've been worried about your apartment and getting your finances back on track. I'd like to offer you a signing bonus of $10,000 in addition to your regular salary." Rebecca felt her breath catch. Between her payment for the current assignment and the signing bonus, she would have enough money not only to catch up on her debts, but to move to a better apartment, buy reliable transportation, and build the kind of financial security she had lost during her mother's illness. "George, I don't know how to thank you," she said, tears flowing freely now. "6 months ago, I thought I had lost everything. I never imagined—" "You don't need to thank me," George interrupted gently. "You're going to earn every penny of what we're paying you. This foundation is going to require someone with your skills, your compassion, and your understanding of what it means to care for people during their most vulnerable moments." The next morning, Rebecca woke up in her comfortable guest room at the ranch and lay in bed for several minutes, hardly believing that her life had changed so dramatically in such a short time. 3 weeks ago, she had been facing homelessness and financial ruin. Now she was about to embark on a career that would not only provide financial security, but would allow her to do exactly the kind of work she was most passionate about. Over breakfast, James provided more details about the Foundation's timeline and Rebecca's responsibilities. She would spend the next month wrapping up her affairs in Austin, finding a new apartment closer to the Foundation's headquarters in San Marcos, and working with George and his advisors to develop policies and procedures for the new organization. "We'll start with a small caseload," James explained. "Maybe 5 or 6 clients who need intensive, personalized care. As we learn what works and what doesn't, we'll gradually expand the program." "What kind of clients are you thinking about initially?" Rebecca asked. "We've already been contacted by several families," George replied. "A woman with early-stage Alzheimer's whose family can't afford private care. A man recovering from a stroke who needs assistance with daily activities. A cancer patient who wants to remain at home during treatment but needs skilled nursing support." Rebecca felt her excitement building as she listened to George describe the potential clients. These were exactly the kinds of situations where personalized, compassionate care could make the biggest difference. Cases where the medical needs were real and significant, but where the human element was just as important as the clinical skills. "When do you think the Foundation will be ready to accept its first clients?" she asked. "We're hoping to be operational within 6 weeks, Daniel said. "That gives us time to handle all the legal and administrative setup, hire additional staff, and make sure you're comfortable with the program structure." As her final day at the ranch approached, Rebecca found herself feeling nostalgic about leaving the peaceful environment where her life had been transformed. But she was also excited about returning to Austin to begin the process of building her new career. On her last evening, George surprised her by organizing a small celebration on the patio. James and Daniel were there, along with George's wife Norma, whom Rebecca had met several times during her stay. The atmosphere was warm and familial, and Rebecca realized that these people had become much more than professional colleagues. They had become friends who genuinely cared about her well-being and success. "I want to make a toast," George said, raising his glass of iced tea, To Rebecca Anderson, whose compassion and skill reminded me why healthcare should be about caring for people, not just treating conditions, and to the beginning of something that's going to make a real difference in the world. As they clinked glasses under the Texas stars, Rebecca thought about her mother, who had taught her that the most important thing anyone can do is take care of others with love and dignity. Catherine Anderson would have been so proud to see her daughter not just surviving her financial crisis, but thriving in a career that embodied everything she had tried to teach about service and compassion. "I have something for you," George said, pulling out an envelope. "Consider it a going-away present." Rebecca opened the envelope to find a check for her full assignment payment, plus the promised signing bonus, plus an additional amount that made her gasp. "George, this is too much," she protested, staring at a check for $15,000. "No, it's exactly right," he replied firmly. "That extra money is for you to take some time off, maybe take a vacation, buy some things you need, and just breathe for a while before you start your new job. You've been carrying tremendous stress for years, and I want you to have a chance to truly relax and enjoy life a little." The generosity was overwhelming, but Rebecca could see that George genuinely wanted her to accept the additional gift. She realized that for him, this wasn't about showing off his wealth, but about making sure someone he cared about had every opportunity to succeed and be happy. "I don't even know how to process this much kindness," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You don't have to process it," Norma Strait said gently, speaking up for the first time that evening. "You just have to accept it and know that you deserve every bit of happiness that's coming your way." As Rebecca prepared to leave the ranch the next morning, she took one last walk around the grounds that had been her home for 3 transformative weeks. The morning air was crisp and clear, and the hill country landscape looked like something from a painting. George insisted on driving her back to Austin personally, saying he wanted to see where she had been living and help her think about what kind of place she might want to move to for her new position. When they pulled up outside her small apartment complex, Rebecca felt embarrassed about the contrast between her modest living situation and the beautiful ranch they had just left. But George seemed genuinely interested in her neighborhood and asked thoughtful questions about her neighbors and local amenities. "This has been your home," he said simply, "and any place someone calls home deserves respect." As they stood outside her apartment building, preparing to say goodbye, George became unexpectedly serious. "Rebecca, I want you to know that what we're starting with the Caring Hands Foundation is about more than just providing nursing care. It's about proving that people still care about each other, that success comes with responsibility to help others, and that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity during their most difficult times." "I understand," Rebecca replied, "and I promise you, I'll do everything I can to make sure the foundation lives up to those values." "I know you will," George said, embracing her like the father she had never really had. "That's exactly why I wanted you to be part of this." As Rebecca watched George drive away, she felt a profound sense of gratitude that went beyond the financial security he had provided. In choosing her for the foundation position, he had given her something even more valuable than money: the opportunity to spend her career doing work that aligned perfectly with her deepest values and passions. That evening, Rebecca sat at her small kitchen table with the stack of bills that had been her nightly companions for so many months. But instead of calculating how far behind she was planning how to pay off her debts, save for the future, and begin building the kind of life she had always dreamed of having. She called her landlord first, telling him she would be moving out at the end of the month, but wanted to pay all outstanding rent, plus a cleaning deposit to leave on good terms. Richard Cummings was so surprised by the call that he asked twice if she was sure she had the money. Next, she called each of her credit card companies to arrange payment in full for all outstanding balances. The customer service representatives seemed almost confused by someone calling to pay off entire balances at once, rather than requesting payment deferrals or hardship arrangements. Finally, Rebecca opened her laptop and began researching apartments in San Marcos, looking for a place that would be comfortable and convenient for her new position. For the first time in years, she was able to focus on what she wanted rather than simply what she could afford. As she browsed through rental listings for spacious apartments with amenities she had only dreamed of, Rebecca thought about the incredible chain of events that had led her from the brink of homelessness to this moment of possibility and hope. Her mother's illness had cost her everything she thought she valued, but it had also taught her about the true meaning of compassion and sacrifice. That experience had shaped how she cared for James Mitchell, which had led to the opportunity to care for George Strait, which had resulted in an offer to build a career around the kind of nursing she was most passionate about. Every loss, every sacrifice, every moment of desperation had been preparing her for this opportunity. The financial crisis that had felt like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something better than anything she could have planned or imagined. As Rebecca prepared for bed in her small apartment for one of the last times, she felt a deep sense of peace and anticipation about the future. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of building her new life, finding a beautiful place to live, paying off old debts, and preparing for work that would allow her to make a meaningful difference in people's lives every single day. But tonight, she simply lay in bed thinking about her mother, who had raised her to believe that taking care of others was the highest calling anyone could answer. Catherine Anderson had been right about so many things, but most of all, she had been right that love and compassion would always be rewarded, even when that reward came in ways no one could have predicted. 6 weeks later, Rebecca stood in the beautifully appointed offices of the Caring Hands Foundation, reviewing the files of their first 5 clients. Each case represented someone who needed exactly the kind of personalized, compassionate care that had driven Rebecca to become a nurse in the first place. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, 78 years old, had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's and wanted to remain in her own home as long as possible. Her family couldn't afford private care, but they were desperate to ensure she received the kind of attention that would preserve her dignity and quality of life. Robert Martinez, 54, was recovering from a massive stroke that had left him partially paralyzed. He needed assistance with physical therapy, medication management, and daily activities, but his insurance coverage was limited and his family was struggling financially. Jennifer Walsh, 39, was undergoing chemotherapy for breast cancer and wanted to continue treatment while remaining at home with her 2 young children. She needed skilled nursing care to manage side effects and monitor her condition, but couldn't afford the kind of private care that would make home treatment feasible. Each file represented not just a medical condition, but a human being facing one of life's greatest challenges without the resources to get the help they deserved. Reading their stories, Rebecca felt the same sense of purpose and excitement that had driven her to accept George's offer. "Are you ready for this?" George asked, joining her in the office they had designed specifically for reviewing and coordinating client care. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Rebecca replied with complete honesty. Over the past 6 weeks, she had worked with George, James, and a team of healthcare consultants to develop protocols and procedures that would ensure every Caring Hands client received the highest quality of personalized care. They had hired 2 additional nurses and a social worker, all of whom shared Rebecca's philosophy that healing involves much more than just medical treatment. "I keep thinking about my mother," Rebecca continued, looking out the window at the beautiful Texas hill country that surrounded the Foundation's headquarters. "She would have been so proud to know that her illness and everything I went through caring for her led to this." "She would have been proud of the daughter she raised," George replied gently. "This foundation exists because of who you are as a person, not just as a nurse. As Rebecca prepared to make her first client visit that afternoon, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The nurse, who had been facing eviction and financial ruin just 2 months ago, was now the lead caregiver for a foundation dedicated to providing exactly the kind of compassionate, personalized care she had always dreamed of offering. The gift George Strait had given her wasn't just financial security or even a dream job. The real gift was the opportunity to transform her greatest loss, the experience of caring for her mother through Alzheimer's, into a source of healing and hope for other families facing similar challenges. That afternoon, as Rebecca drove to her first appointment with Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, she carried with her not just medical supplies and treatment plans, but also the knowledge that every person she would care for was someone's beloved mother, father, spouse, or child. They deserved to be treated with the same love and dignity she had tried to provide for her own mother. The small sedan she now drove was reliable and comfortable, purchased with part of her signing bonus. Her new apartment was spacious and filled with sunlight, located just 15 minutes from the foundation's offices. Her bank account showed a balance she had never imagined possible, and her credit report no longer kept her awake at night. But more important than any of those material improvements was the sense of purpose and fulfillment that filled her days. She was doing exactly the work she was meant to do, in exactly the way she had always dreamed of doing it. As Rebecca knocked on Eleanor Thompson's door, preparing to begin her first official day as lead nurse for the Caring Hands Foundation, she thought about how dramatically her life had changed since that morning 6 weeks ago when she had faced eviction and despair. Sometimes, she realized, losing everything you think you need is the first step toward finding everything you never knew you wanted. And sometimes, the kindness of strangers can transform not just your circumstances, but your entire understanding of what's possible in life. The door opened, and Eleanor Thompson smiled at her with the kind of grateful warmth that reminded Rebecca exactly why she'd become a nurse in the first place. Behind that smile was a person who needed care, compassion, and dignity during one of life's most challenging chapters. Rebecca smiled back, introduced herself, and stepped across the threshold into her new life, a life built on the foundation of loss and sacrifice, but sustained by the incredible power of human kindness and the knowledge that taking care of others is not just a profession, but a calling that can transform both the giver and receiver in ways that seem miraculous, but are actually just the natural result of love in action. 6 months later, Rebecca received a letter that would become one of her most treasured possessions. It was from Eleanor Thompson's daughter, written after her mother had passed peacefully at home, surrounded by family and cared for with dignity until her final breath. "Dear Rebecca," the letter began, "I will never be able to adequately thank you for the gift you gave our family during Mom's final months. Because of your care, she was able to stay in the home she loved, maintain her independence as long as possible, and die with the dignity she deserved. But more than that, you helped us understand how to love her through the disease, and you showed us that even in the darkest times, there are angels among us disguised as nurses. Mom often told me that you reminded her of her own daughter, compassionate, strong, and completely dedicated to doing what was right rather than what was easy. She said you had a special gift for seeing the person inside the patient and for making everyone feel valued and loved. I know this work must be emotionally challenging, but please know that what you do makes all the difference in the world to families like ours. You didn't just provide medical care. You provided hope, dignity, and love when we needed it most. With eternal gratitude, Susan Thompson." Reading the letter in her comfortable office at the Caring Hands Foundation, Rebecca felt the same sense of profound purpose that had sustained her through her mother's illness and driven her to accept George Strait's incredible offer. The foundation now served over 30 clients, with a waiting list of families who needed their services, They had hired 6 additional nurses, 3 social workers, and a full administrative staff. George's vision of providing high-quality, personalized healthcare to people who couldn't otherwise afford, it was becoming a reality that exceeded everyone's expectations. But more important than the foundation's growth was the knowledge that every day, Rebecca was doing exactly the work she was meant to do. She was helping families navigate some of life's most difficult challenges with love, dignity, and hope. As she finished reading Susan Thompson's letter and prepared for her next client visit, Rebecca thought once again about her mother and the chain of events that had led her from despair to fulfillment. The woman who had taught her that caring for others was life's highest calling had been right in ways neither of them could have imagined at the time. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as losses, and sometimes the people who seem like strangers turn out to be exactly the angels we needed all along. George Strait's unexpected gift hadn't just saved Rebecca from financial ruin. It had shown her that when we care for others with genuine love and compassion, that kindness has a way of returning to us in ways we never could have planned or imagined. The king of country music had shocked a nurse who had lost everything, but the gift he gave her wasn't just money or even a job. The real gift was the opportunity to transform pain into purpose, loss into love, and desperation into a life of meaning that honored both her mother's memory and her own deepest values. And in giving Rebecca that gift, George had received something equally valuable in return: the knowledge that his success and resources were being used to make a real difference in the world, one family at a time, through the hands and heart of a nurse who understood that healing is about much more than medicine. It was, Rebecca realized, the kind of gift that keeps giving long after the initial surprise has faded, the gift of a life well lived in service to others, sustained by the knowledge that love and compassion never go unrewarded, even when that reward comes in the most unexpected ways from the most surprising sources.